So Robert Baird with CITL here. Welcome to Fall Into AI event. I'm really excited because iSchool is one of my, I'll say it on camera, one of my favorite schools on campus. It's so cool and diverse, the folks over there. And today's session, Elucidating Boundaries on Ethical AI Use in Higher Education, Synthesizing Governance and AI Literacy, Professor Madelyn Rose Sanfilippo. I was just telling you how yesterday at lunch, I was talking about AI policy because it's moving fast and things are changing and it's not there and it's impacting higher ed in the whole world. So I'm really excited to have you here because I think AI and policy is something everybody's talking about and not just policy wonks and professionals and experts, right? So I was really intrigued by your background too. It's quite diverse. So I did want to read a few things. You're an assistant professor in the iSchool. And your research, you empirically explore governance of socio-technical systems. You're an affiliate at the Ostrom Workshop at Indiana University, co-PI of Workshop on Governing Knowledge Commons, and a series editor for Cambridge Studies on Governing Knowledge Commons. And I really like this. You had studied environmental studies, international studies, political science, and Spanish at the University of Wisconsin, information science at Indiana University, and then you had some postdocs, right, at New York University's School of Law and the Center for Innovation and Technology Policy, and at Princeton as well. So a really nice, wonderful, diverse background. And I think by the end of this session, you will have settled AI policy for all of our
Answer all our questions.
We'll start an exploration and a conversation. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I come to this topic, obviously, with a pretty interdisciplinary background. I really aim to be able to be a bridge between people with policy and legal knowledge and people with technical backgrounds. And so interdisciplinary training myself, I've worked in a law school, in a computer science department before coming back to information science. And I come specifically to this topic with a really personal example. So I want to talk about the first hallucination that I ever saw from AI. ChatGPT is released November of 2022, and I am teaching IS 202 here on campus, Social Aspects of Information Technology, which has a writing assignment, large course paper due right after ChatGPT comes out. And we've divided up grading between my TAs and myself. I grade paper 1 and it's fine, and I grade paper 2. And in the first paragraph, there's a citation to a paper that I have apparently written. This paper, the citation is here, I had to save it for posterity's sake, is co-authored apparently with someone I actually do co-author with. But that year looks suspicious. I don't think we published anything in that year together. And this title also looks like a very strange amalgamation of things I have written about, but have not written about together. It's in a real journal. The issue number is wrong for the year, and it's, the volume number is wrong for the year, and it's an issue that doesn't exist. There are only 12 issues per year in pages that don't exist. I don't have a word for AI hallucination yet. But suddenly all of my grading for all 180 students in my class is unraveled. What do we do if all of the research papers they are citing are fake? And as someone who studies governance, someone who cares about having productive dialogue and healthy decision-making around technologies that are influencing people in everyday life, this obviously got a bee in my bonnet. This has started a whole new trajectory in my work and thinking about what we can do, what we can learn from other tech policy contexts in order to solve real problems in our lives, not just introduce regulations. And so in this talk, I want to give you a little bit about the research that I've done in this space in the past few years, but I also want to talk about the strategies that I am experimenting with in my own classes, and hopefully start a broader conversation about how those things may work in others' classrooms, and what other ideas people have come up with. And while I'm trying to solve this problem, I'm keeping in mind that the student perspective, the interests across different stakeholder groups are going to be different. literally earlier this week, I had a student submit in their attention check from lecture that they can't even imagine a life without ChatGPT. It's so embedded in the way that they address things that attempting to wholesale prevent it is really an inappropriate boundary. We've got to find more common ground here. And so what I'm trying to think about in this talk, and I guess I will note that every time you see an orange slide, you are welcome at this point to engage. Usually something I do in my classes, but I'm really thinking about how AI can be ethically integrated in higher education, not wholesale prevented, not blindly adopted in ways that are going to diminish critical thinking skills. And in order to do that, we actually have to articulate what the norms are, what appropriate uses might look like. I don't think there is any consensus about that yet. We need to think about what appropriate limits are. Again, not a lot of consensus, a lot of opinions, but not so much in the way of agreement. And then we really have to think about who is responsible for doing this work, who is responsible for articulating those boundaries, who is responsible for teaching AI ethics and literacy. Is this a general education competency? Does this need to be embedded in every program of study to think about the ways in which appropriateness might be contextual to different fields, to different future career paths, and so on? And so in recent research, a large group at the iSchool has focused on where sources of confusion lie in LLMs in higher education. A pair of papers I'm going to draw on in this section really focused on different stakeholder perspectives and understanding how instructors, students, and administrators thought about LLM use as was emerging at the time of the work in 2023 and in 2024. And really what we came to as a conclusion is that even though there is not yet consensus about the appropriate boundaries, there has to be some coordination, because without coordinating mechanisms, everyone is left to fend for themselves, and the confusion is leading to significant conflict. We need to clarify what boundaries might be, and those boundaries might change as the technology changes, as stakeholders gain more or less awareness. But precision and specificity are important to this, even if it's going to change in a punctuated sort of way, because without that, we have the sort of free-for-all we're currently struggling with. This work identified from speaking to instructors and students and administrators a variety of different concerns. Many of these things are going to be the sorts of concerns you've likely thought about elsewhere, but it's really helpful to surface these in their own words, not just from expert opinions or anecdotes, in order to determine what different mental models might be for appropriate AI use. And so beyond thinking about the challenges specifically in hallucination, as I mentioned earlier, or other inaccuracies or biases that might be embedded, one thing that came up that was, I think, really important, even given the team of researchers, we didn't all agree on what appropriate use would look like in the first place, obviously. And what came up in this study that I think really caused some of us to pause and to think the limits that we were currently playing with in our own classrooms were discussions of accessibility and academic integrity that spanned diverse populations of students. And so the first piece that came out of this project that I think caused me to stop personally were the students who talked about how they used AI to convert course materials, to make things more accessible to them, things that were not accessible by design. And as everyone is dealing with Title II compliance, we know that's not an easy feat, actually. Hearing how they were using AI in ways that helped them adapt and to make things usable to students with different sorts of needs was actually interesting to me. This seems like a useful use case. If you have students who, have trouble perhaps focusing, reading the text, but do better with, an audiobook or an ebook, which might not be available for a material, is it really that problematic if they are asking one of these systems to help them with that? Similarly, we thought we had models of academic integrity, and we started to listen to some of the instructors and some of the students and their perspectives, and found actually that their intentions in some of these cases were really good. Again, we would have students who spoke to using AI to get summaries or to translate things that were perhaps in another language, something they weren't familiar with, but were trying to understand a particular context or example in a research project. These seemed not like such problematic uses, but things that required guidance, things that required scaffolding so that it could be done ethically and appropriately. The intention was good, but without that structure, we were challenged. Through the work, we highlighted different mental models, in particular that students had around LLM utility in computing education. I think intuitively, many of them thought about ways in which AI might serve as a helpful writing tool. This is obviously a place where we run into some of the challenges that motivated the work in the first place, but it also speaks to particular applications that are perhaps not so different than spell check or tools we might use. Is Grammarly inherently against our interests as educators, for example? It's not something I think there is wide consensus on. We had students who spoke to mental models around how it could be a coding tool. And again, initially there was more resistance, and then we recognized the ways in which alumni and interview processes were highlighting the need for students to be ready to co-code with these systems, to be educated in that rather than to do it in unsupervised ways, sort of leading us to rethink learning objectives and different assessment needs. And then finally, we had the students who spoke to the use of LLMs as an information tool. Again, some of these uses seemed reasonable to us. There may be some common ground to pursue, while others highlighted the challenges we saw around hallucination or bias that we were concerned with in the first place. And I think with these mental models, we were able to think about the ways in which we might need to, it's not advancing.
Just on your computer. It's
No, it's advancing
Oh,
there.
but
It's
it's
not
not
advancing
here.
on the screen.
Okay. This is our new beautiful video wall that has some problems, some teething problems.
Sorry, Madelyn. We'll get it worked out.
Apologize.
Madeline, while we have a little break here, I wanted to ask a question because
Sure.
it's striking me. So I love that slide now that it's disappeared. But, policy and ethical considerations, academic ethical considerations, and we're the teaching center. And maybe it doesn't fit to add a concern onto that ethical list, but I think you shared. But is it an ethical consideration to worry that a person or a student isn't learning or developing their skills? That outsourcing or the easy button thing, is that ethics or is that more under the umbrella of humans
Pedagogical.
learning? And is it a pedagogical thing or couldn't that be an ethical thing
I
too?
think it's an ethical thing as well, thinking about what our responsibilities are in educating them and what we are really saying as we assess them and move them through what amounts to a credentialing process for their futures if they are unable
Yeah.
to think in particular ways, if they have outsourced that
Yeah, my
entirely.
analogy would be you're doing driver education
Yes,
and somebody's using a robot chauffeur.
sure.
I ethical thing for that person and the institution and everything and the society if that person actually doesn't know how to drive because the robot did it, right?
Right, right. And so thinking about the ways in which we can find common ground and teach students to use AI in ways that support or enhance their own thinking or capabilities rather than in ways that diminish it.
And I think you allude to that when you're very intentional about saying that they're using them in reasonable ways. And we think they,
Some of
in
them
each of
reasonable,
these
yes.
categories, there were reasonable uses for it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Or possibly reasonable, depending
Yeah,
on
yeah.
Well, that was
depending on the application.
and that was a difference too that I saw and Dave and I are similar because when we've taught, it's in that kind of multimodal and students creating things.
Yeah.
And especially for English as a second language learners, but just for anybody, if you're coming from the transpose and translate something into your own words or into a podcast or into a thing,
Right.
it's a learning activity. And then I also have the traditional, you should read it in Latin originally if you really, really care about it and want to be a scholar
Sure.
thing. But there's a power to transposing things and AI with a student can transpose a lot of things into different formats and
Figuring out that line is really where you're
Yeah.
at here.
Right.
Have you seen any difference between disciplines, like as far as what they can tolerate? I can imagine
Definitely.
some disciplines will see, like, I'm getting these students ready for using AI in industry, and it's very well accepted.
Yes.
Others, maybe like in the creative fields, like, literature or something like that, and just keep away from it.
Yeah, I think there were definitely differences in responses by disciplines in this work and more widely in the literature. And I think that is intuitive, that the norms about appropriate uses are going to be bounded contextually. We, as I'll show actually ideally in an upcoming slide, we also see differences between like what broad norms are at research universities and at liberal arts schools. There are sort of community expectations about how much work you should be doing and how independent that should be versus how collaborative.
Ah,
Right.
Hey, that's great. Okay. Is it okay to proceed? Wonderful.
Yes.
Okay. So I think what we did with that work was aim to articulate the ways in which we need to adapt in policy and education in terms of thinking about, governance at a regulatory level that goes beyond privacy regulation. We need to think about where the boundaries are to ensure that harms associated with AI are not impacting our students. We also need to make sure that governance in terms of institutional levels are appropriate, ensuring that, for example, student inputs into these systems are not being used to train future models or are not being sold to data brokers. Having appropriate governance in that respect becomes important, and ensuring that which is articulated in policy is actually in effect in code and in design as well. We thought about the ways in which one size fits all solutions are not actually probably appropriate, exactly with the example given that different disciplines are going to have different needs. Thinking about the degree to which, our computer science students definitely need to know how to engage with these systems in ways that are going to be appropriate for their careers. Are even, thinking about disciplines that have historically been more prone to lots of individual, independent, long form and handwritten writing, like law schools, thinking about, where are the boundaries for appropriate use? What sorts of expert systems? How does the Bloomberg system work? And when can you use that? How do you double check to make sure it has not hallucinated things? And where are you able to appropriately be transparent about those uses? We've thought about the ways in which we need to think about responsibility and accountability in these spaces. Certainly things are going to go wrong. We see how infrastructure breaks this week in particular.
Yeah.
We should be conscious of those things and have plans to, communicate about them, to make sure that those who are developing and deploying these systems are not, manipulating or being non-transparent with institutions or with students and instructors as users. We also want to think about how we can increase, engagement and communication between stakeholders in order to find that common ground in particular and ensure that, digital literacy issues around AI competencies in this space are appropriately disseminated in not just higher education, but all levels of education. And so I think the natural next question is to think about what universities might already be doing to respond to these challenges. Certainly, there are lovely dialogues going on lots of places, series like this, committees that are aiming to understand, the needs and the issues, efforts to, contract specific licenses for different solutions, Copilot and ChatGPT and whatnot. And so we conducted a survey. I worked with a postdoc at the iSchool who's now new faculty member at Catholic University of America. And we took the kind of arbitrarily chose the top 100 research universities as ranked by US News and the top 100 institutions for undergraduate educational excellence. There's a bit of overlap there. So we ended up with 174 universities, and we reviewed all available public policies they had around AI. Many of these were strategic documents, not meaningful rules. They spoke to the ways in which, committees might be formed, or they aimed to adopt these in particular programs. Other places offered documents that translated how existing academic integrity rules applied to AI uses. There was a wide variety of kind of hard and soft rules in this sense, things that were enforceable, as with academic integrity, and things that were aspirational. Perhaps this is a norm that these classes must teach this, but what happens if they don't? Not clear. In reviewing all of these policies, we found that in particular, there were some thematic categories that were, helpful to illuminate not just the sorts of issues different universities were considering, but also the degree to which their strategies had actually coalesced into norms on campus or might be enforced as rules. They were understandably very preoccupied with issues of academic integrity. They were thinking about what sorts of values matter to their institution, their university community, and how that might be translated into particular learning objectives or boundaries that might be imposed. They were trying to articulate ethics. In some cases, they were pointing towards ethical frameworks for AI or for technology broadly, and considering the ways in which this might be implemented. But very, very few of them actually did anything to make sure that was being disseminated into the instructors and the classrooms that were going to be responsible for it. Largely what this work showed us is that while there are good faith efforts towards this, right now, most of the responsibility is at the individual level, which is making things really challenging to have coordination. It's sort of pointing back to the first study where we find that even when there are rules in individual classrooms, they are different across all of the classrooms. For students who are taking 4 or 5 classes in a semester, to have 4 or 5 different sets of rules poses a lot of challenges. There is easy opportunity for things to go wrong or for people to break a rule, even unintentionally. And what we wanted to do with that thematic coding, as well as with sort of structured institutional analysis, was identify specific strategies, norms, and rules, and look at overall trends. These documents that we collected and coded showed, very prevalent strategies that did not reflect any degree of consensus. There were a ton of different approaches to exactly the same aims. Even if we want the same thing, we are not coming at it in the same direction. And this was most notable around when uses of AI constituted violations of academic integrity. And that was really interesting to me because if you otherwise look at academic integrity statements from universities, they are not actually all that different. And so why this in particular is so hard to dovetail with those systems is certainly an interesting area to continue to study. In terms of norms, there was some consensus, not just within institutions, but between institutions, when we looked at that intersection of teaching and research excellence. So as I mentioned in the previous slide, there's 174. Effectively, we had 26 institutions that appeared on both lists. And those institutions were the schools that seemed to have some agreement. They were drawing on empirical scholarship to try to develop policies, and their statements looked relatively similar. In particular, where this was clear were the places in which they were speaking to how AI ethics and AI literacy would be incorporated in programs of study and in general education requirements. And so that's perhaps a really good first step to try to address some of the questions and concerns and learn from other schools. Do you have a question?
No, I'm,
Okay.
I'm thinking I'll ask
Okay.
questions later.
Sounds good. There were very few rules overall in these policies, even when they stated that there was a rule, they did not articulate enforcement mechanisms. And so it was not clear what a penalty would be for a violation. It was also important to note that the vast majority of the rules that we identified were simply extensions of other rules to AI. As in, this existing rule in the student code also applies if you are using AI. It is treated the same as if you are, plagiarizing a source, for example. So if we have a high degree of diversity, how should universities govern AI? Again, that normative component, I think, requires agreement between stakeholders, not just articulation of best practices, not top-down kind of directives from people studying this. I think finding common ground is really what's key. Part of what we aim to do, just to summarize that last study in this space, was to surface the spaces where concerns or where patterns appeared most successful. I think it's really important that we identify who is responsible for AI policy and governance, particularly at the level of individual institutions, stating that, or not stating who is responsible, or stating that this is left up to everyone to decide for themselves, is not going to solve the problem. That's not autonomy, that's dysfunction. We need to think about how we establish competencies for ethical AI education. Again, I think that's really a precursor to a lot of these other aims. Based on the cases we identified at that intersection of teaching and teaching and research excellence, I think it's important that requiring technology ethics to a degree in general education becomes an important piece of that. It's not just establishing ethical AI education by discipline, it's ensuring that everyone in a world that's widely technologically mediated knows how to deal with these issues in a responsible way. We also think it's really important to establish multi-stakeholder processes for collaborative governance. This means that students and administrators and educators all have a role, and that there is multi-institutional dialogue. We're having some communication between schools and establishing as a domain of higher education what broad patterns and trends might look like, because it's certainly really hard to regulate anything, for example, down the line, if what we are dealing with is a patchwork of local policies and strategies that differ absolutely everywhere. This kind of normative and aspirational piece is certainly not just in my own work. And so I want to highlight this piece that I co-authored with a number of other faculty here at Illinois. This was an op-ed effectively that appeared in Communications at the ACM and spoke to the different ways in which universities should play a role here. And this was speaking not just to how universities need to address the literacy pieces and the governance pieces in their own institutions, but also speaking about how the mission of conducting publicly important research, empirically supporting the policymaking process, needs to be revisited around AI. This is not just research that is driving commercial innovation, but also research that is going to support the appropriate social bounds. We spoke a little bit to the ways in which community collaboration is a key piece of this. Again, not just understanding administrators, staff, faculty and student perspectives, but also the ways in which AI are impacting broader communities. And then the roles we might play in governance processes at the legal and regulatory level in our communities, states, and at the national level. So this is the place where I suppose I want to transition a little bit to thinking about what individual educators might do in the meantime. Again, this is not the end solution, but rather something that's important because inaction is only exacerbating the problem. These speak to the strategies I've tried to take in my own classes, some of them drawn from the literature or discussions with others, but I want to offer some possible ideas. One thing that I think is really important is to find common ground with students. That's sort of where I started, and I want to echo that. I teach at both the undergrad and the grad level, and I often try to identify what applications of AI might be appropriate. For example, in an assignment, I might indicate, question by question, where and how AI might be used appropriately. Is it okay to check your reference format with AI? I think so, yes. Is it okay to say, I have 3 project topic ideas and I don't know which one to do? Can I feed them in and ask for pros and cons of writing about these things? I think that's okay as long as you're disclosing it. Can I use something like Grammarly to edit my paper? Yes, again, please disclose that this is what you've done. Maybe give me the drafts so I can see how your paper evolved through that process. But those are reasonable uses in my mind. I also actually strongly encourage my students to use AI to organize their notes. I give open note exams, and their notes are chaos. They are so voluminous. They are not very helpful for that purpose. And so I've always told students it's okay to study with one another as long as you disclose how you produced maybe a shared note document prior to the exam. But what I've started doing is in review sessions, explaining how they might take, if 3 members of your group have 3 different definitions for something, if you've taken notes in different ways based on our lectures or our readings, how might you synthesize those? One way to do that is to say, what are the areas of overlap if this is a Venn diagram, using AI to distill lots of information into shorter representations that can be more easily referenced. If they go from 50 pages of notes to 5 pages, that's actually useful, I think, for them. And they're talking about it and they're doing this collaboratively. It's not a passive spit out the answer for me, it's productively. How might this be useful to you? I also actively engage my students in discussion about these things. I realize I have the advantage of teaching a class called Social Aspects of Technology, for example, but this lends itself really well to figuring out what course norms might be. I was really interested this year to poll my students at the beginning to find how many of them were afraid of using AI because they thought the repercussions would be really high. They didn't even want to take classes where they might learn to use it appropriately because they were afraid that might have repercussions in other classes. That was kind of fascinating to me and not something I expected to find at all. Thinking about what ethical uses might look like beyond the classroom has been really helpful, helping the students, understand where use of AI might breach non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements in particular fields, where hallucinations might pose great risks in specialized fields like law and medicine, what responsible use might look like that mimics the sorts of solutions we are using in class for professional applications is helpful to them. And then I think it's also really important to assess the strengths and weaknesses of different systems for specific applications and contexts. Before we started today, I was talking about the distinction between expert systems and generative systems. I think this is one of those examples. Having something that is trained for a particular context and use case is actually probably appropriate in that context and use case. Having something that is a generalist chatbot might not be in specific sensitive cases. This extends to the way I think about assessment. I think it's really important to have clear rules with associated consequences at the level of individual assignments. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all approach, even for a whole class. In some cases, I will indicate that if we have evidence, and honestly, most of the students are pretty forthcoming when we talk about this. If there is evidence that you have used AI outside of the boundaries, this would result in a loss of points on a particular assignment. Or this might lead you to need to rewrite this particular assignment. In other cases where specific uses of AI would be treated as related to specific line items in the student code and would be referred to FAIR proceedings. And I think those are not all the same. Similarly, I also make clear where those appropriate uses would be around citations or Grammarly and things like that. And every assignment comes with an AI disclosure agreement for students to indicate what they have done and to provide drafts if that's necessary for a particular use case. I think it's led a lot of us to rethink assessments for the AI era. I've certainly heard about a lot of colleagues going back to fully analog handwritten tests and bubble forms and things like that. I find that the accessibility trade-offs there are not great for my class. And so I've thought instead about how my learning objectives might be reconceived and how we might map assessments to those things. I don't actually care if they memorize things. I don't actually think memorization's super valuable. What I am trying to get at in a lot of my courses is how you deal with the messiness of reality. And so the sort of questions that ask students to explain their thought process or to, analyze particular examples rather than defining a concept or telling me who came up with a theory, seem to work better for the courses that I am teaching and for the context, which is effectively critical thinking about the social implications of technology. I think it's also important to demonstrate where uses, so beyond the discussions about what it might look like in professional cases, to demonstrate actively what this might look like in the classroom. I give real examples in real time of how systems are going to generate hallucinations and how I would identify that, what resources they might use to uncover that, or how they might ask the system simply to justify itself in order to uncover errors or biases. We look at how well AI does in completing particular tasks. For example, I feed it an exam from the prior year when I start my class, and I show that AI is actually not very good at completing the exams if the aim is not writing quality, is not plausible general jargon, but an explanation of a thought process that relates to the things we did in class. It isn't in our class. We talk about competing definitions of theories, and it's going to choose the thing that is most common in its model, in the data it has access to. If it is, able to search broadly on the internet, it's going to come up with whatever comes up first, not necessarily the scholar that we learned in our class. And I think this is a useful illustration for them that if you're comfortable getting a C and potentially breaking all of these rules that are going to have other penalties if we identify that, proceed. If you would like to do better than that, let's look at how we might use these appropriately and within bounds. I also try to help them learn from professionals about, what best practices look like or where people are engaging with them in those areas. And so guest lectures offer a really nice opportunity for that. I try to experiment in context, again, to think about what is appropriate in this course, what is appropriate in the discipline. Some of that has been, speaking with the other instructors of the same courses in the iSchool. Some of that has been speaking to people who are teaching the course at another institution. Certainly not everything is going to be feasible for each course. And so some of my colleagues have come up with really great other sorts of rules and boundaries, and they're maybe not quite right for what I'm doing. I think it's really important to also, keep up to date with how AI is changing and how student use patterns are changing. Again, the optimism I saw last year when I gave students the same poll on the first day was very different than the sorts of concerns I saw this year. And I think that perhaps speaks to where we are in the overall hype curve on AI, which doesn't mean people are going to stop using AI, but that we probably are going to think about what uses are and are not appropriate. So thank you so much, and I'm happy to discuss.
There is one question in chat, and I'll ask that one first, but then maybe there are other questions in the room. Andrea asks, I'd be interested in finding out how syllabi at UIUC are being updated to reflect the instructor, if not the institution's, AI guidelines and strategies for that course.
I would also be interested in this. In the iSchool, we do share syllabi going back a number of years, and so we can kind of see how that has changed, but it is a topic I think that should receive a bit more attention and transparency beyond individual programs where you might have access in that way. I have not done that work, but perhaps it's a good suggestion for a PhD student to start to work on. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Learning objectives. I think there's some common ground there with, even though that maybe different classes and different institutions can't tolerate or can't, don't envision particular uses of AI. Every class has learning objectives that AI can disrupt. Faculty put a lot of work into their classes, and of course, it's very difficult to revise those learning objectives because, then it changes the nature of the alignment, the assessments, and everything else.
Right.
But the industry is changing too, so it's going to take a lot of effort to change those AIs to make them. Learning objectives to make them meaningful for students to graduate with.
Yeah.
And I think those discussions around learning objectives might be helpful for teachers and students to have those conversations, and as it is a commonality, even though they're different across all classes and institutions, that could be the point of agreement, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice framing and neater than perhaps I've put it thus far. So I appreciate that. I think that certainly what we want students to learn in a course and what they want to be able to say they are capable of doing when they are done is an area we can agree on. And perhaps illustrating the ways in which AI disrupts some of those aims is the right way to have the conversation across different stakeholder groups.
I like the part where you were talking about how you encourage students to explore the messy process of thinking through. I wonder if you can talk through that a little bit more by giving some examples. What do they give you, and
Yeah.
how do you manage that messy process?
Yes. Okay. At the grad level, I teach a course in data governance. And when I came into the course, I think it had been taught maybe once before I arrived on campus here. And the examples they used to teach many of the data governance problems were these really stylized hypotheticals. They were nice examples to illustrate things, but they didn't look like the reality of data governance at all. And so one thing that I did was to start to surface cases, live cases, real messy human socio-technical cases that came from different organizations where I knew people who worked either from grad school or people who had been research participants in my projects before, and bring those projects to students so that they can see the ways in which their assumptions, the ways they have read about it in textbooks or other assigned readings, often oversimplify things. I feel it's much more important that they realize the weight and the difficulty and the challenge of reality in many of those use cases than it is that they come to a neat final answer in many cases. I think this speaks more to what they will need to do later on. And I think it's really applicable in an AI era where, the assumptions are often that systems are giving us the correct answer. Again, this kind of goes back to the accuracy issues, the hallucination issues, bias issues. And the reality is they are prediction machines. They are built on a messy model and they are giving us the answer that they think is likely to satisfy us most as quickly as possible. Kind of this trade-off between what are my limits and the incentives they have to give someone an answer, even when they don't know. And in working through the messiness of real problems, I think students get a better sense both of the limits of AI in that sense and the fact that there isn't one right answer, that there are many possible answers.
So just as a follow-up, what
Yeah.
do they give you exactly? Do they just give you drafts? I'm
Oh,
curious to know about that
Yeah.
process.
I mean, in data governance, they are producing like project deliverables. So it's a lot more, frameworks and visualizations and matrices that kind of illustrate how decision making should happen in particular cases. And so often what they're giving me are many possible paths forward. I don't have the best answer. I would need to test these to have the best answer, but a student will give me something like 3 possible solutions to this problem that aim to optimize for different, organizational design
Very
objectives
helpful.
or interests.
I agree with what you've said so far and with just kind of like how you've presented this. My question being with this has been in this context, in the
Yeah.
context of higher education.
Sure.
How do we take what you've done here, what you've been talking about, and trickle it down
Yeah.
to lower education? Because
Yes.
AI is in the classroom
Yeah.
now for
It is.
young students.
Yes, it
and-
is. So I will try to speak to this more broadly, but I will preface my answer with saying that I lead a Girl Scout troop. So I am experimenting with this with some small children at the moment, trying not to experiment on them per se, but to iterate what we might do that speaks to them. And I think it's really important, obviously, that we are dealing with this earlier on, but actually that there is more conversation between those who work on educational standards and do this sort of research with researchers and those who are conducting continuing education for teachers. We are not just expecting them to suddenly know how to do this, but rather thinking about how we can be in their conferences, how we can be in their continuing education courses and develop those competencies in that way, because it needs to go through the educators really before it can go to the students. I am I am not trained in elementary school pedagogy. I do not have those skills, although I have a lot of enthusiasm. I try not to teach that or to treat them like college students, but to kind of think about how I can best create opportunities for them to engage with systems and create almost games that are analogies to these things. And so I'll give an example specifically. So one thing that I've been doing, not just with my Girl Scout troop, but with a handful of like 2nd to 4th grade classrooms in the community, is doing a misinformation workshop with them. And AI comes in here. And so we start actually with a really simple game. They play telephone. And we see how like errors can emerge just through the nature of the game. But then I start to give students in the group different instructions about how to intentionally disrupt or reroute things, or how adding in multiple messages can create confusion. So we play a series of about 10 rounds of telephone for them to identify all the places in which it gets wrong. And sometimes those things are bot generated messages. And sometimes those things are, deep fake videos where they think they have evidence. They have seen it with their eyes and it is not true, but they also have to communicate this around the circle and reflect on it at the end. And I think it's a really good opportunity to talk about what sorts of sources you can trust, but also the importance of triangulating things. I don't have all the answers, but I agree that I think it's really, really important.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.